Today I'm going to spend just a few minutes with you on a story sizing technique that I found that works really, really well. It's very, very simple. It's easy to create. The spreadsheet that I use to help teach the team how to use points. Remember, this is not something you need to do with the team forever, but when you're working with a team that's beginning to learn how to apply Fibonacci story sizing, they start to ask all sorts of questions like, do the points correlate to duration? Should we be talking about how many hours? Do the developers get their points and the testers get their points? We add them together. So the developers say it's 3 points and testers say it's 2 points. Should we add it so it's 5 points? Is that how this works? Exactly right. They begin to ask you a bunch of questions. And really what we want to do is just make this very simple. There are a couple of things that we need to think about. That a small story, a 1-point story, should be an easy story to execute. And it should be done very quickly. If it's a 1-point story, but it takes 6 weeks, is that a 1-point story? No, that's a ridiculous example, Curtis. But I can't tell you how many times I've seen a 1-point story that took, 8 days. And they said, well, it was really easy. I had a developer who carried a 1-point story over for several sprints. And because I was young and inexperienced, I was too intimidated by this older expert to challenge him and say, hey, why didn't you complete a 1-point story? We'll get into that here in a second. All right. There's a whole bunch of things that could go wrong. So what I want to do is just say, all right, here's a very simple technique to cut through a lot of the noise and get you started. And it enables you to calibrate the table and sets you up later on for relative size. Keep in mind then, what you're looking for is a small story. So you're going to start by asking the team to identify the simplest user story that you could probably get done in a half day or a day. All right. And they'll be able to find something, say, oh, this is really easy. This is something we're doing. And that's where you want to start and start using that as a model to talk to them about. This is called calibrating the table or calibrating the scale. And that's where I usually start. So this is a spreadsheet that I created in an Excel. And you notice that it has a few different little parts to it. Okay. So you have up here the Fibonacci scale, 0, 1/2. I did it as a decimal. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40. And this is the normalized Fibonacci scale. We generally create a limit for ourselves and we say no story greater than an 8 can come into a sprint. But I allow when we're doing sizing, it can go up as large as they want. You'll notice over here that I have sizing considerations. For example, volume of work, steps, the things that they have to do to get it done. It doesn't mean anything about difficulty or anything like that. It just means there's a lot of little things that I have to do to get it done. You may recall that I said that I had a developer who had a 1-point story, carried it over sprint. It's because he had a series of small tasks he had to do. And let's say there were 100 of them. And each one of them took a half a day. Or maybe it's just 2 hours. But by the time he did all of them, it would be a long duration. But because he had understood that we size stories based upon complexity and risk, he said there's almost no risk and there's almost no complexity. It's a 1-point story. I just failed to ask, well, why didn't you finish the story? Because I was scared of him. I was a young guy and he was older and very wise. And so it took me a couple of sprints. Actually, I was on the 3rd sprint when I finally had the chutzpah to challenge him and say, help me out here. Why do you keep carrying over a 1-point story? And then he explained, well, I've got, 100 tables I have to copy and go over and then validate the data. They're not hard. It's a lot of time. I said, so why don't we just split that into small pieces? Do 1 story per table or 1 per grouping or something. Oh, we can do that, he said. All right, so there you go. So that's what I mean by volume of work. The unknowns is, for example, these are things we've never performed before. It's a technology we've never used. There'll probably be some trial and error, some experimentation. Complexity, this is where you start getting into, we know what we have to do. We just know that this is a brittle part of the code. It's difficult. A lot of external sources use this. So therefore, we have to be super careful because if we break anything here, it could break all sorts of systems and bring it all down. All right. So that's what complexity is. And then there's lack of knowledge or skills. If you've never used Spring before, and this is your first time to use Spring, then it may take a lot of research to understand how to use this new technology. A high score means increased difficulty, increased risk. And of course, if there's increased difficulty, increased risk, increased research, guess what's going to happen? Your duration is going to increase. So story points are a proxy for duration, but we use them so we don't think about duration when we get started. We think about these other things, which are easier to understand. Is it simple but repetitive? Are there unknowns that could cause us trouble? Is there complexity that we're aware of that could cause us risk and difficulties? Or are we lacking specific knowledge and skills? And volume, unknowns, complexity, lack of knowledge, the V.U.C.K. That's what I call it, the V.U.C. factor. Here's where you can add in your little points. Over here, I have a scale color code guide. So if it's green, it means it's a small story, good size, low risk. Let's go for it. If it's yellow, it means medium size effort, but it might be all right. Medium risk. We might consider slicing it. We might consider swarming it. And we should limit how many of these medium-sized stories we have, especially all at once. So we prefer smaller. We can handle medium. What about large? So when it goes to pink, it's going to be large, probably too big. And this is a candidate for slicing or swarming or both. Let's next look at the guide to modified Fibonacci sequence. So 0 to 0.5, extremely small and easy. Forget about it. It's easy. We got to just go. A 1, very small effort. Probably takes a day. Let's move on. Small, quite simple, around a couple of days. That's a 2-pointer. Small, quite simple, around a couple of days. 3, starting to be medium, but it's manageable. Okay? Few days, maybe a week if we have problems, but it's a few days. You notice that I'm just quickly setting it up as I'm starting with the team. I give them a simple concept to think of. And yes, it correlates back to time, but I'm going to minimize the thought of time. Right? That's important because we don't want them to get hung up on arguing over time. Number 5 is a medium, but it's starting to get riskier. We're starting to run into some issues. 8, it's large enough it probably couldn't get completed in the sprint. It might. And if we can't figure out how to slice it, this one you probably have to swarm. Right? Look for my video on slicing and swarming. Anything above 13, it's large, too large. It's probably a feature. Forget about it. We can't even try it. We have to look at how to slice this up. So how do we use this? So what I do is I get the team to bring up their stories, and we begin to go through there. And we say, okay, so on this story 01, how would you score this for volume of work? Is it a high volume story? Let's say that it's a 1. How about unknowns? Are there any unknowns? Generally not. We've done this before, but there's always something that could pop up. All right, well, let's give it a little half point there for unknowns. How about complexity? Not very complex in this story. All right, and lack of knowledge and skills? No, we've done it all. Okay, good. So you can see it actually creates a nice little visual right here. This is a nice 1-point story, considering the volume, unknowns, complexity, and the knowledge and skills. Let's do the same thing again. Let's say, remember that developer I told you about? I asked him the question, well, what about volume of work? Yes. It's a lot of work. Well, now I know. Look, no unknowns, no complexity, lack of knowledge and skills is fine. It's just a volume of work. We'll slice this puppy. Next, let's go back to, so the volume, let's say it's another story. Volume of work is not that big. Let's give it maybe a 3. The volume of work is probably about a 3, medium. How about unknowns? No. How about the complexity? Yeah, it's a little brittle. It's a little difficult. Is there any lack of knowledge or skills? No. Cool. Then you can see right there, for just the volume of work, it's about a 3, and the complexity is about a 2. So this story is a 3. All right, this story has probably a fairly small volume of work, almost no unknowns, but the code is fairly brittle or difficult. There's a lack of knowledge. Yeah, this time there's a little bit. It's a new technology we're bringing in. Okay, cool. So this one, again, looks like one you could try in the sprint, but it runs some risk. So then I would start asking questions about how can we slice this differently? Well, we aren't entirely sure about how to work with this new technology. We'd have to do some research. Well, what if you ran a spike first to go and test and experiment and play with it, spend a couple of days doing that before you commit to the story? Okay, yeah, that would be great. That would take out a little bit of the complexity or some of the risk. Then we can come back and re-examine this. And let's suppose that on this one, you actually have a fairly high volume of work, and the complexity is fairly high, but you're not sure what's driving the sizing. All right, I'm actually going to make it a little bit higher than that in volume of work. And so they're saying, well, yeah, this is going to be really hard to get done in a sprint. So now you can see that for the team estimating the volume of work they have to do and the complexity of the work, it sets it as an 8. You could go with an 8 and just work on it. Say, hey, why don't you guys just swarm this and try and shorten the duration in the sprint so we can get it done in the sprint. But you could look at it and say, well, let's examine this for slicing. Again, go back and see my video on slicing. And one of the things that we want to do then is detail out the subtasks. So what we've done is we've created, we have to write the test cases, we have to do some design work, create an interface. Now there's several services here, get, put, and post service. There's a business rules engine. We have to write our unit tests. We have to do a code review. Manual testing has to be done. We do have to write automated integration and regression tests. And then we have to do the merging and deploying. We have a total of 89 hours on this. So we can tell it's too big for one sprint. Now you could swarm it, but there's some risk. So what I start to do then is the step dependencies. And I'll talk about this in my video on swarming, because what I'm looking for is instead of doing all 12 tasks one at a time, can we double up where the several of them are being worked at the same time? And so by going through here and saying, does writing test cases have does anything else have to be done before I can do that? No. How about the design? No, that would be first. Okay, so neither of these have a step dependency. How about creating the interface or the services? Yeah, we need to have the design first. Aha, we've discovered a step dependency. So I've color-coded these to say, all right, these have a step dependency. I might also say, do we have to do the get, put, and post service all in the same story? No, we could just do the get first. Great. Then you have a way of slicing that out. And if that was 7 hours to get each one of those, you've just reduced it by 14 hours. So just the effort on the API is reduced to 1/3 of the former effort. Okay? Step dependencies, the number of hours estimated. And now I can go through the rest of these. Unit tests. Does it have a dependency? Not really. If you're doing test-driven development, or TDD, they usually do unit testing at the same time that they do the code, in which case there probably won't even be a unit test task. But most teams I've seen actually do their unit test at the end of the sprint, which is unfortunate. That's really not best practice. But you can only do so many changes at once. Let's meet them where they are, and then slowly start making improvements after that. So let's assume they have that code review. Okay, great. Is there a dependency? Yeah, I have to have my development done, they would say, before I can write my unit tests. Could you do a little bit of unit tests for each time you finish one of the automation? Could you do it that way? Sure, I could do that. Okay. All right, so you could slice it that way as well. So when you do your get API, you do your get unit test. And then when you do your put, you do your put unit test, correct? Yes. So you can begin to see how you can slice that as well. It's not just one big bucket that can't be handled. How about the manual testing? Well, obviously, once I finish my get, I push it over and let the tester test the get. And then when I do the put, they test the put, et cetera, et cetera. But it does have a dependency. I can't test it till it's built. Once it's built, I can test it. So that has a dependency. So you can't really do the testing at the same time it's being built, but you can do it in small pieces. How about writing the automation test? This is the BDD type of stuff. Given, when, then. That can be done separately, completely separate. In theory, you could write that separately. More often than not, the developers will write their code and their unit tests at the same time, and then the BDD will be written as they're moving along. They'll be writing some of these unit tests, the scenarios that cover certain pieces of functionality. I have seen where they do it toward the end. I've even seen where they do the automation like this at a feature level and extract it so that they can slice the story smaller. All of those are acceptable. And then, of course, merge and deploy can't be sliced out. When I would get a big story like that, I'd take them back through the step dependencies and those questions and see what can we slice it? Can we swarm it? How can we reduce the duration and reduce the size of this story? Generally, it works very well. Hit me up if you have any questions. If you think it's a terrible idea, let me know. Put a comment in there. And if you really like it, also, please let me know. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.